The market square in Dusty Hollow pulsed with the raw energy of the New Mexico frontier, a chaotic symphony of dust and desperation. Horses snorted their hooves, churning red earth into clouds that stung the eyes and coated the throat. Cattle bawled from rickety pens, their lowing drowned by the shouts of men haggling over barrels of flour, stacks of pelts, and tarnished heirlooms strewn across gnarled wooden tables. The sun blazed high, its heat relentless, baking the air until it shimmered like a fever dream. Wagon wheels creaked, spurs jangled, and the sharp tang of sweat and whiskey hung heavy in the breeze. But in one shadowed corner, where the crowd's clamor dulled to a tense murmur, the air carried not the promise of profit, but the bitter weight of despair. On a platform of splintered, sun-bleached boards stood a woman, her three small children clinging to her frayed skirts. This wasn't a sale of goods. It was a transaction in misery, a grim thread woven into the rough tapestry of this frontier town. Clara Dunn stood rigid, her hands knotted in the faded blue calico of her dress, its hem tattered from months of wear. Her three children, Elijah, a boy barely 3, with his father's dark curls, and his twin sisters Lila and Rose, their faces pale as milk huddled behind her, their small hands clutching her skirts. Their eyes wide with uncomprehending fear darted across the crowd. Clara was too young to be a widow, her face still soft despite the lines etched by grief and hunger. Her husband Tom had been a miner, a man with dreams bigger than his means. When the copper mine closed, he'd turn to whiskey and poker, gambling away their savings until a fever swept through Dusty Hollow and claimed him, leaving Clara and their children to face his debts. Now they were the collateral herded onto this platform like cattle at auction. Silas Vernell, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel scraped across iron, stepping forward. His fist wrapped in a cracked leather glove, jabbed toward Clara, his shadow looming over the platform. Her man owed me $800, he roared, his words slicing through the crowd's hum like a whip. Lost it all at poker, then dropped dead in the saloon, leaving me empty-handed. She and her young'uns are mine now. I'll work her till the debt's paid, and them kids will learn to earn their keep one way or another. Clara's voice, when it came, was a cracked whisper, barely audible over the creak of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle. They're just babies, she said, her fingers tightening around Elijah's small hand, her other arm pulling the twins closer. They don't owe you nothing. Please let 'em go. Her plea hung in the air, fragile as a spider's web, unanswered. Varnell's lip curled into a sneer, his eyes cold as a snake's, glinting with the cruelty of a man who saw people as property. His hired man, Caleb, a wiry brute with a scar running from ear to jaw, grabbed Elijah's arm and yanked him forward. The boy cried out a sharp, keening sound that pierced Clara's heart. Lila and Rose screamed, their small hands clutching at her dress as Caleb tore them away, their wails cutting through the crowd like a blade through cloth. Clara sank to her knees, her arms wrapping around Elijah as he was ripped from her grasp. No, she cried, her voice raw, desperate, echoing across the square. Not my children. Please, God, not them. She lunged forward, grasping at the air where her daughters had been, but Caleb's rough hands shoved her back. She felt her palms scraping the rough board splinters, biting into her skin. She crawled toward Varnell, sobbing, reaching for his boots, her fingers clawing at the dust. I'll do anything, she gasped, tears streaking her face. Just don't take them. Varnell's boot caught her side, a dull thud that sent her sprawling. Blood bloomed at the corner of her mouth, bright against her pale skin, and she gasped, curling into herself. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Cruel, careless, the sound of men hardened by the frontier's unrelenting grind. A merchant spat into the dust, his face twisted with disdain. A half-drunk cowboy called out, "Get on with it, Varnell." "Ain't nobody paying for a show?" Then, from the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. Amos Teller, a tall man in his late 30s, weathered by sun and silence, moved with the deliberate calm of a man who'd seen too much to rush. His coat, the color of baked clay, hung loose on his lean frame, its edges frayed from years of wind and wear. His boots, caked with the red dust of Redstone Canyon, thudded softly against the earth as he set a bottle of rye on a nearby plank and strode toward the platform. The crowd hushed their eyes, following him, some with curiosity, others with mockery, a few with the faint hope of something unexpected. His shadow fell across the boards, long and steady, like a promise carved in stone. "I'll pay the debt," Amos said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade through smoke. for her and the children. A ripple of laughter met him, sharp and disbelieving. A cattleman, his hat tipped back to reveal a sunburned forehead, smirked, his voice dripping with scorn. "You got that kind of coin, stranger. That coat says you're broke as a busted wheel." Varnell thumbed through a stained ledger at its pages curling at the edges, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at Amos. $600. Cash. By noon tomorrow, or they stay mine, and I ain't one for charity. Amos reached into his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. The crowd leaned in, expecting a wad of bills or a glint of gold. Instead, he drew out a small brass pocket watch, its face scratched but catching the sunlight in a brief, defiant gleam. He laid it gently on the table, his fingers lingering for a moment, as if parting with it cost him something deep. "This was my father's," he said, his voice steady but weighted. "It's all I got today, but it's worth something to me. I'll bring the rest tomorrow. You let him go." Varnell stared at the watch, his lip curling into a sneer. "You're a damn fool, Teller, trading your kin's keepsake for a woman and her brats. You think this'll square it?" Amos met his gaze, unflinching, his gray eyes steady as granite. "Then I'll prove I ain't foolish." He turned, picked up his bottle of rye, and walked away, the crowd parting like a river around a boulder. On the platform, Clara's sobs quieted her breath, hitching as she stared at the watch. Confusion and a faint flicker of hope mingled in her eyes like a candle struggling to stay lit in a storm. For one ragged moment, amidst the cruelty of Dusty Hollow, someone had seen her worth. The wagon creaked along the rutted trail, the sun sinking behind the jagged cliffs of Redstone Canyon, painting the sky in hues of fire and blood. Clara sat in the back, her arms wrapped tightly around her children, their small bodies pressed against her, as if she could shield them from the world's sharp edges. Elijah nestled against her chest, his curls damp with sweat, while Lila and Rose clung to her sides, their fingers knotted in her dress. Every jolt of the wheels sent a shiver through her, but she barely noticed, her mind churning with one thought: she'd been bought again. She'd known too many men who offered help only to demand more than they gave her body, her dignity, her soul. She didn't look at the man driving the wagon. She couldn't. Fear kept her eyes on the horizon where the last light bled into darkness. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, lost in the creak of the axle and the soft thud of hooves. "Thank you, sir," she said, her head bowed, her words trembling with submission. "I'll work hard. I'll do whatever you say. You won't regret it." Amos Teller didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the trail, the reins steady in his calloused hands, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. The horses climbed the final rise, their breaths puffing in the cooling air, and a small cabin came into view. Its logs weathered but sturdy, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the sagebrush, carrying the faint scent of dust and pine. Amos stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel, and lifted the children one by one, Elijah first, then Lila, then Rose, carrying them inside with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. He set them on a straw mattress by the stove, its warmth cutting the evening chill, the firelight casting soft shadows on their small faces. He handed Clara a tin mug of water, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and pointed to the mattress. "You and the young'uns sleep here tonight," he said, his voice low, steady like the roll of a distant river. "I'll be in the barn." Clara blinked, startled by the words, her hand tightening around the mug. She stood frozen, waiting for the catch, the demand, the price. But Amos was already gone, the door creaking shut behind him, leaving only the sound of his boots fading into the night. That night, she lay curled around her children, their small breaths a fragile rhythm against her chest, their warmth the only thing keeping her anchored. Her ears strained for the inevitable knock, the heavy tread of boots, the voice that would call her to pay for her safety. She'd paid that price before, too many times, in back rooms and shadowed alleys when Tom's debts had left her with nothing but her body to barter. But the knock never came. The only sounds were the wind rattling the shutters and the soft crackle of the fire, its glow a faint promise in the dark. By dawn, Clara was up, driven by a fear she couldn't shake. She scrubbed the cabin's floor with a rag torn from her skirt, her hands chapping in the cold morning air, the rough boards drinking in her sweat and tears. She hauled water from the well, her shoulders aching under the weight of the bucket, and stirred a pot of cornmeal mush over the fire, her fingers trembling from exhaustion and cold. If she worked hard enough, she thought maybe he'd let them stay. Maybe he wouldn't take her children, wouldn't send them to the mines or the workhouses where small hands were cheap and lives were cheaper. When Amos stepped inside, the morning light framed him in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. He looked at her. Really looked her, hands red and swollen, her dress damp from labor, the scent of smoke and sweat clinging to her like a second skin. "You don't need to work yourself to death," he said, his voice calm but firm like the steady roll of thunder in the distance. "Just tend to the young'uns. That's enough." Clara froze, the wooden spoon trembling in her hand, the mush bubbling softly in the pot. She turned her eyes, searching his face for a hidden cost, a veiled threat, a glint of the hunger she'd seen in too many men. But there was none. His gaze was steady, not possessive, not demanding, just kind like the warmth of the stove on a winter morning. For the first time since Tom's death, she met a man's eyes and saw not a master, but a man. Her breath caught, and she nodded, unable to speak, the weight of his words settling into her bones like a truth she'd forgotten how to trust. Days bled into weeks, and Clara rose before dawn each morning, unable to shake the fear that idleness would cost her this fragile sanctuary. She swept the porch until the broom bristles, frayed mended clothes until her fingers bled, and cleaned the horse stalls until her shoulders screamed the smell of hay and manure clinging to her skin. The work was her shield, her proof that she was worth keeping, that she could earn her place here, could keep the world from taking her children again. Amos never asked her to stop, but he never demanded more either. He moved through his days with quiet purpose, his hands always busy chopping wood with a steady rhythm, mending fences under the wide sky, tightening the hinges on the cabin door so it no longer squeaked in the wind. The children, though, took to the place like colts to a meadow, their laughter a bright thread in the quiet of Redstone Canyon. They chased a grizzled mutt named Rusty around the yard, giggling as they tossed sticks for him to fetch his lopsided grin and wagging tail a constant companion. Elijah Bold, despite his small size, started calling Amos Quiet Pa, the name slipping out one afternoon as he tugged at Amos's sleeve, his dark eyes bright with mischief. Lila and Rose echoed it, their voices high and clear, their giggles filling the air like birdsong. Amos would grunt, his weathered face softening just a fraction, but Clara caught the faint smile that tugged at his lips like a crack of sunlight through storm clouds. Amos's hands were never idle. He fixed the sagging porch step, its wood warped from years of rain and sun-hammering nails, with a precision that spoke of years spent building and breaking. He patched the roof where shingles had peeled away, climbing the ladder with the ease of a man who'd scaled cliffs and canyons. He carved 3 small stools for the children, each one just the right height for the kitchen table, their edges sanded smooth to spare their small hands. He etched their initials, ELR, into the legs, his knife, moving with the care of a man who knew the weight of small things the way a single gesture could anchor a heart. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon, painting the sky in hues of amber, and Rose Amos left a wooden box on the table and walked away without a word. Clara opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a bone-handled brush, its bristles worn but soft, a folded linen scarf with faint embroidery, and 3 pairs of knitted socks, small enough for her children's feet, the wool soft as a cloud. She ran her fingers over the socks, their stitches tight and careful, and knew he'd made them, his calloused hands working late into the night by lamplight. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. The seasons turned, and winter gave way to a tentative spring, the earth softening under patches of melting snow. Clara knelt by the porch, her fingers stained with soil, as she planted seeds she'd found in a rusted tin poppies. Sagebrush and desert marigold's flowers her mother had taught her to tend back, when her world was still warm before debt and death had stripped it bare. The children ran barefoot through the tall grass, laughing as they chased Rusty, who bounded after them, barking at butterflies and tumbling into the dust. Elijah tugged at Amos's beard one afternoon, his small fingers bold and teasing, and the twins collapsed in giggles when Amos pretended to scowl, his gray eyes bright with quiet amusement. From the window, Clara watched a dishcloth in her hand, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, yes, but laced with guilt, a heavy knot that tightened with every act of kindness. Every moment of peace felt stolen. Every gesture from Amos a reminder of the watch he'd traded for her freedom, a keepsake that carried the weight of his past. She worked harder scrubbing pots until her hands bled, mending clothes until her eyes ached as if labor could earn her place. Here could keep the world from tearing her children away again. One evening as Amos hammered a new shutter into place, its wood still smelling of fresh pine, Clara stepped onto the porch, a small bundle in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a silver hairpin shaped like a sage blossom. Its edges, worn smooth by years of touch, a relic of her mother's love, carried through years of loss. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice low, trembling with the weight of the offering. "You gave up your father's watch for us. I can't let you carry that alone. Take this. Get it back." Amos looked at the pin, then at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the fading light. "No," he said, softly, his voice rough from years of silence like the scrape of boots on gravel. "Memories like that ain't for trading. Keep it." Clara nodded, clutching the bundle, and returned inside her steps slow, her heart heavy with the weight of his refusal. That night, after the children slept, their small bodies curled together like puppies under the quilts, she knelt by their mattress and wept. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen, not owned, of being given a chance to heal without a price attached. The next morning, she joined Amos on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between them, the air sharp with the scent of pine and earth. She took a breath, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "My husband wasn't, yet always a bad man," she began, her words careful like steps on a narrow ledge. The mind shut down and dead. "He swore it'd be fine, but then they came for us. He left a note, said he'd failed us. I found him in the river the next day, his body cold as the water." Amos listened, his fingers tracing the grain of the porch rail, his silence not awkward, but shared, weighted with understanding. "We don't always choose how our story ends," he said quietly, his voice like the low rumble of distant thunder. "But we can choose what comes next." Clara smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You taught me that," she said, and the words felt like a vow, fragile but firm. Rumors spread like wildfire in Dusty Hollow, curling through the saloons and feed stores like smoke under a dry sky. Whispers claimed Amos hadn't paid the full debt that he'd stolen Clara and her children, that he'd made a fool of Silas Varnell. Varnell didn't take kindly to being mocked, his pride as brittle as dry tinder. He sent Gideon, a lean man with a serpent's smile and a knife always at his hip, to Amos's cabin. Gideon rode up under the guise of a trader, his voice smooth as oil, his eyes glinting with malice. "Heard you got a fine garden," he said. When Clara answered the door, Elijah clinging to her skirt, his small face wary. "Thought I might trade for herbs or eggs." Clara stood in the doorway, her body half blocking the cabin's interior, her instincts screaming caution. "We don't trade much," she said, her voice polite but firm, her hand tightening on the doorframe. She offered him a handful of dried sage, the leaves crumbling slightly in her grip, and sent him away with a nod. But her hand shook long after his horse disappeared over the ridge, its hoofbeats fading into the dusk. 2 nights later, she stepped outside to shake crumbs from a cloth and caught a glint of steel near the barn, a shadow slipping around the feed shed, silent as a coyote. Her heart hammered, the cloth clutched tight in her hands, her breath shallow. The children were inside asleep on their mattress, their small faces peaceful in the firelight. Amos was in the barn loft, his breathing steady in the quiet. She crept toward the shed, her bare feet silent on the cold earth, but the figure vanished into the trees before she could call out, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the pounding of her pulse. In the morning, Amos found a knife buried in a porch post, its bone handle carved with a coiled snake, the blade thin and cruel, meant to send a message. He pulled it free, his jaw tight, his face unreadable, the steel glinting in the pale dawn light. Clara stood behind him, holding the screen door half open, her voice soft but steady. "I saw someone," she confessed. "2 nights ago near the shed. I didn't want to worry you." Amos nodded once, his fingers tightening around the knife's handle, then turned and walked to the barn. Clara followed her steps, hesitant, watching as he knelt beside an old cedar trunk, its hinges rusted but sturdy. He opened it, brushing aside a folded Union jacket and a pair of worn boots, and drew out a rifle wrapped in oilskin, its barrel dull with age. He sat on a bench, cleaning it with slow, precise movements, oiling the chamber, checking the sight, running a claw through the barrel, his hands steady despite the weight of what he held. "You were a soldier," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words heavy with realization. "Long ago," he replied, not looking up, his voice rough but calm. "I carried this to kill, to survive battles I wish I could forget. Now I carry it to protect." Clara stepped closer, her hands folded tightly, her eyes on the rifle. "Protect us," she said, her voice soft but firm, a plea and a promise intertwined. The storm came hard that night, wind howling through Redstone Canyon like a banshee's wail, bending the cottonwoods and rattling the porch boards. The sky was slate, the stars swallowed by clouds thick with rain. Clara stood on the porch, her nightgown whipping around her legs, her hair dancing in wild tendrils, the cold biting at her bare feet. She should have gone inside, but something in her refused to turn away from the storm's fury, as if facing it could prove she was stronger than her fear. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Amos stepped out, a heavy coat in one hand. He draped it over her shoulders, his touch brief but steady, and stood beside her, his presence solid against the wind's chaos. They stood in silence, the storm a wild song between them, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine. "You're going tomorrow, ain't you?" she asked, her voice cutting through the wind, steady despite the tremble in her chest. "To get the watch back," he nodded, his eyes on the horizon where lightning flickered like a warning. Why she pressed, turning to face him, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. A question that had haunted her since the market square. "You don't owe me nothing. Not a single thing." Amos looked out at the dark, his face shadowed by memories older than the wind, his breath visible in the chill air. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice low and steady, like the roll of a distant river, "my father died in a mine collapse. We had nothing, no money, no home, no hope. The landlord turned us out, said we weren't worth the dirt we stood on. My mother got sick, and I buried her under a sycamore, alone with nothing but my hands and my tears. I was 10. I swore that day I'd never walk away from someone who needed me, someone the world had left to die." Clara's breath caught her eyes, filling with tears that blurred the storm's wild edges. She stepped closer, her hand finding his small and trembling, but certain, her fingers curling around his calloused palm. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice breaking but strong. "I tried," he said, his voice barely audible, and the silence between them felt like trust, like a vow that didn't need words, sealed by the storm and the weight of their shared scars. Amos left at dawn, the sky bruised with gray, the air heavy with the promise of more rain. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay named Cinder, and packed light water jerky, a map folded tight in his coat pocket, its edges worn from years of use. Clara stood on the porch, the children huddled around her skirts, their small faces solemn as they watched him mount. Elijah reached out his small hand, brushing Cinder's flank, and Lila and Rose clutched Clara's dress, their eyes wide but trusting. Amos gave a small nod. 2 days, maybe 3, and rode off the trail, stretching long and hard through the badlands of the old mining country, where ghosts of the past lingered in the dust. He passed ravines he'd crawled through as a boy, their walls scarred by time and greed. He rode by battlefields turned silent where men had fallen and left only echoes and cabins rotting into the hillsides, their roofs caved in like broken promises. By dusk, on the second day, he reached a rocky slope hidden behind a thicket of junipers, their branches sharp with the scent of resin. He dismounted, tied Cinder to a tree, and climbed to a shallow cave, its mouth half hidden by shadow. The rock bore scars of the war scorch marks, dried blood legends etched in stone, faded but unforgotten. Kneeling by a slab, he dug until his hands bled the earth, reluctant to yield its secrets. Finally, he unearthed an iron box, its hinges rusted but intact. Inside were 3 silver coins, dull but heavy, his last earnings from a war he'd tried to forget. He'd thought he'd die before spending them, but now he'd spend them all for a family he'd chosen to protect. In Dusty Hollow, the saloon was alive with noise. Laughter, boots, scraping glass, and clinking the air thick with the smell of whiskey and tobacco. Silas Varnell sat in his corner, his fingers curled around a glass, his eyes narrowing as Amos walked in, dust trailing behind him like smoke. Amos unwrapped a cloth bundle and laid the coins on the table, their dull gleams silencing the room, the clatter of dice and cards falling still. "For the watch," he said, his voice steady as iron. "And for their freedom." Varnell sneered, his fingers tightening on his glass, his voice dripping with a contempt. "Silver ain't enough. You know the price." Amos didn't flinch, his gray eyes unyielding. "You set a trap, but I don't deal with men who trade in children. She's free. They're free, and you know it." Varnell's eyes flickered with greed, his gaze darting to the coins, then back to Amos. Something in Amos's stance, steady, unshaken, a man who'd faced death and walked away, made him pause. "Take your watch," he spat, tossing it across the table, the brass glinting as it skidded. "And don't come back!" Amos caught it, his fingers closing around it, and turned, walking out. Without a word, the saloon doors swinging shut behind him. The ride back felt lighter, the weight of the silver gun replaced by the small, warm bundle pressed against his chest, a piece of his past reclaimed for a future he was building. Spring bloomed softly that year, wildflowers carpeting the hills around the cabin like a promise kept. Clara's garden thrived, poppies, marigolds, and sage glowing under the sun, their colors bright against the red earth. The children's laughter echoed as they played with Rusty, weaving flower crowns and chasing him through the grass, his barks mingling with their giggles. The cabin, once a place of shadows and silence, smelled of bread and soap, of mornings begun with purpose, and evenings spent in peace, the firelight casting a warm glow on the walls. One morning, Clara sat by the window, the watch Amos had reclaimed resting in her palm, its brass warm from her touch. She wrote in her journal, her hand steady despite the weight of her words. "He gave up his father's watch to save us. If he ever places it in my hand, I'll keep it forever, not as a debt, but as a promise." That afternoon, Amos led her to a field behind the cabin, the earth soft under their boots, yellow mustard flowers blanketing the hill like sunlight woven into silk. The children followed, giggling, their flower crowns askew, Rusty bounding at their heels. Clara wore a simple dress she'd sewn, its pale green catching the light like new leaves. Amos wore his patched coat, a new clasp she'd made from leather scraps gleaming at the collar. He took her hands, his eyes steady, scarred and deeply kind, the lines on his face telling stories he'd never speak aloud. From his pocket, he drew the watch now, polished its back, engraved with new words, "Clara, chosen by my heart." "This was my father's," he said, his voice firm but soft like the first rain of spring. "I gave it up to save you. Now I want it to be yours, not because I owe you, but because I choose you. I choose you every day." Clara's eyes brimmed as he fastened it around her wrist, the metal warm against her skin, its weight a reminder of his sacrifice and his love. There was no preacher, no crowd, just the sky, the wind, and the children dancing around them, Rusty barking at butterflies. They shared bread and dried apples, laughed with neighbors who'd wandered up the hill after hearing the news, and watched the sun sink behind the canyon, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold. That night, Clara lay against Amos's chest, her fingers tracing the buttons of his shirt, the fire crackling nearby, its warmth, a quiet promise. "You remember what I called you first," she whispered, her voice soft but strong. "Master," he said, a faint smile in his voice, warm as the firelight. She laughed softly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I ain't nobody's property now. I'm a woman you chose, and I choose you." The world was quiet beyond their walls, the wind a soft lullaby through the cottonwoods. In a land where debt could chain a soul, one man stood up not to own but to honor. And one woman, broken by loss, found that love wasn't owed, it was chosen. This was not a tale of rescue, but of redemption earned, of dignity restored, and of a family born not from blood, but from courage built on a foundation of trust and love in the heart of Redstone Canyon.